Sunday morning, it's appropriate for something special, something sacred. We have a short meeting and a long agenda, so I'll try to exercise discipline here. Our project this morning is either a major breakthrough for ourselves in understanding our place in history, or brazen egomania. We want to try to see ourselves, or rather our self, as a trinity, and our self, this group, this kind of activity, in a broader view of history, in the sweep of history, in the line of some great idea or bad habit which has characterized the human spirit for a long time, and to experiment with the idea of connecting with such traditions as are perceived by cultural historians. There's two particular themes that I want to describe as just two possibilities for understanding ourselves in the historical tradition, and they are Utopianism and Millenarianism. So in a nutshell, utopia is a word that in our language has become pretty much synonymous with nonsense, and we may not want to see ourselves in this tradition. But as understood by cultural historians, utopianism is one of the major currents of the European mind, and not an old one. According to the view of the specialists of the subject, utopianism, although it has ancient roots, for example, any kind of idealistic fantasy of the future, we would call that utopian. So we have the concept of the ideal city in the ancient world, most especially the ideal city of Plato's Republic. So casually we might call that a utopian fantasy, although Plato did try to actually realize it in the political organization of a particular city. He ended up in jail for that effort. Another thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we choose whether or not to associate with this particular strand of the human endeavor. But according to these historians of the European mind, utopianism begins on a particular day, at a particular moment, and it's recent. It's less than 500 years old, and in that time became a main theme, a chief characteristic theme of the European mind. And that day was the day of publication of a book called Utopia by Thomas More, M-O-R-E, in 1516. And this word, utopian, the title, is a translation into Latin of the Greek utopos, meaning nowhere. And this was its initial chief characteristic feature, is that it was acknowledged to be nowhere. This was a dream not to be made real. Also, it was fiction. It had, characters and plot and story and kind of like a soap opera, presenting in fictional form various themes of ideal achievement that our culture could strive for. After 1516, there was a tremendous rise in popularity. Well, this book sold real well and had a lot of imitators. So there was a huge genre, body of fictional works, which became the foundation of the utopian trend. But eventually, branched into nonfiction as historians began writing literary criticism about this tendency. And after nonfiction began to be realized, materialized in actual communities that tried to live up to the utopian ideals of some or another novel or nonfiction work in this genre. For example, thinking of recent books in this type, we could think of Rian Eisler's book, The Chalice and the Blade, one of the most popular books in our group in the world today. This is a perfect example of the nonfiction utopian work. And I imagine the specialists of this, well, I could name them. There's a couple, a husband and wife team of historians who made their life work the chronicling of this particular trend. And they're called Frank and Francie Manuel. They worked 25 years and produced a book 900 pages long, and they plunked it down and said, we just cannot carry this burden anymore. We've hardly began, but somebody else has got to carry it. And they plunked down this 900-page book in 1979. In 1979, looking back on the history of utopianism since 1516, they said, well, the last chapter in their book is entitled Twilight of Utopia. Twilight of Utopia. They saw the trend ended. 500 years, that was it. Probably under the influence of our common experience in the 1960s, when the hippies of California, Paris and other places, Amsterdam, the Provost, did try once again to materialize a new utopian ideal in actual practice, and this even strove for a planetary society based on ideal lines, which completely and totally failed. So at the time of their writing, they saw the utopian literary current dried up and ended. Nevertheless, since then, since 1979 and the publication of the book, there are certain surges of renewal in this literature. For example, Rian Eisler's book, published in 87 or 8, I think. Another nonfiction work of this type, we could look at Rupert's book, The Rebirth of Nature, a year ago. This year, Terence's book, Food of the Gods. I mean, this is just, I'm not saying we must see ourselves in this tradition, but I think certainly if the Mr. and Mrs. Manuel wrote a revised edition of their book, they would definitely include these authors in their list. My unpublished book, Chaos Gaia Eros, could be considered a kind of a chaos utopia. Rupert's book, Scientific Utopia. Terence's book, Psychedelic Utopia. Rian Eisler's book, Partnership Political Utopia. I mean, there's different sorts. And in this 900-page work, we have a catalog, every author, thousands of works, thousands of communities that started and then were stopped. All are chronicled in temporal order in this work. And Paul Tillich, writing about this trend in 1951, made an interesting identification with the Trinity of the prehistoric goddess, manifest in Christianity, let's say, as the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He said that with this particular Trinitarian utopian model was presented long before Thomas More in 1516 in the works of Joachim de Fiore in the 12th century. So let me just read a few words of Tillich's understanding of the Trinitarian structure of the utopian genre, and I think this will help us to see ourselves in history. The result is that The overwhelming majority of these utopias show a triadic movement. The original actualization, namely actualization of the essence, and then a falling away from this original actualization, namely the present condition. And third, the restoration as an expectation that which has fallen away from its primordial condition is to be recovered. One of the distinguishing characteristics of this triadic movement is the consciousness on the part of those who use this symbolism, almost without exception, this is important, that the lowest point of the falling away has been reached in their time, in the moment in which they themselves live. It is always the last period that gives birth to utopia. Illustrative of this, and perhaps also the best formula that has been given for it, is Joachim de Fiore's idea that we live in the age of consummate sinfulness. Also illustrative is Augustine's idea that the world empires that had come to an end with the last one, the great Roman Empire, which he as a Roman loved, and that their sole successor is to be the kingdom of God, which is in some measure actualized in the church, but whose final actualization will take place only after the close of history. The same idea is found in India, where it is always the last period in which the theologian who speaks of a succession of ages finds himself. In Greece, where the Stoics speak about the Iron Age, the last, the most wicked. In Marxism, where the class struggle running through the whole of history is seen to have reached a point where revolutionary change has become inevitable, because without it the human situation would move beyond all hope of redemption. In the biologic fascistic ideologies, where decline, decadence of Nietzsche, has reached its final stage, where a counter-movement must set in. All of these instances show that the triadic progression is centered on the moment in which the reversal is immediately imminent. This is characteristic of all utopian thought. Now, another line, millenarianism. There are a lot of these, but millenarianism has roots in the Jewish idea of the Messiah, that there will be a coming of God on earth to rescue humanity from a fatal impasse. The version that this evolved into in the Christian tradition, the apocalypse that is described in the New Testament, where there would be a third coming of Christ in a transformational period lasting 1,000 years. So this was, I think, it's not only the millennium as, for example, the year 1000 or the year 2000, but also the idea of a special period somewhere of 1,000 years that's transitional to our final salvation. Salvation is an important aspect of the millennial idea. But the millennial tradition actually begins after the year 1000, when many people were disappointed that there wasn't, there were a lot of activities. Terence has referred to this 3-year period that's centered on the year 999, is that right? Mm-hmm. So after that is the beginning of a new millennial hope and an extensive literature and an extensive actualization in, movements. You can call them movements. And these are characterized always by a prophet, the propheti, the charismatic leader of a movement, a group of people, sometimes very extensive. So there is another magisterial historical work on this movement by Norman Cohn, published in 1950 and revised after new discoveries in 1971. And in this book, incredible catalog, prophet after prophet, movement after movement, the beginning, the middle, the end, the literature, the analysis, the description of the similarities and so on of all these movements, including the Quakers, the Shakers. I mean, there's so many. This also, like the Utopian movement, is an aspect of the European mind. It takes place within the context primarily of Christianity, and these millenarial groups are all heretical groups, departing from one or another dogmatic aspect of the organized church. So, besides this Christian heretical tendency, they tried to organize communities which epitomized a certain ideal. Almost invariably, they included sexual freedom as one of the similar tenets, arising repeatedly in reaction to the idea of sin and sexual repression in the Christian tradition. In the revised work of Norman Cohn of 1971, there is an extensive appendix in which is translated virtually all of the extant literature of one particular group, which I think in the 17th century was, so coinciding with the rise of science in England, was very popular in England, and they are called the Ranters. This group, I think in particular, reading about it, brought up certain similarities with our experience in the 1960s and today, a movement in which the prophet obviously is Terence.
Not Ice Cube.
And this, one of the chief and to me most mystifying aspects of the millenarian movement, as opposed to the utopian, is triadic. We have, before that was good, which we have now, which is the deepest depression that will ever be seen in human history, and we have tomorrow, where the virtues of yesterday will be restored, together with new enhancements, like designer drugs or something that will be even better. On the other hand, the millenarians are dominated by the apocalyptic idea, where human history will end at a certain moment with the eschaton, the eschatology of Christianity, culminating in some kind of final moment, which is not found in other religions. And certainly two of the most outstanding exponents, I think, of this tendency today are Terence and Jose Arguelles, who both agree not only on the eschaton, along with Teilhard de Chardin, but also they agree on the date, the year 2012, based on, in different ways, they came to this agreement. Between these two tendencies of the European mind in reaction to Christianity, the utopian and the millenarian, there is a certain overlap, and there are important similarities and differences. So somewhere in the neighborhood of this overlap, I think we could see our own trinity in our 10-year history of doing what we're doing now. And maybe if this isn't too egoistic to try to consider ourselves in these historical trends, at least we could say that these trends may have influenced us, perhaps unconsciously, in coming to the positions that we've taken. And in case that's so, we might want to consider the outcome of other people who were under the influence of these traditions as they unconsciously responded to these deep runnels in the morphic field of our culture. So, the context for self-reflection.
Well, I think it's very illuminating, that model. It makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it clarifies a lot of things. I mean, I can see in myself both tendencies at work. The utopian tendency is something that's clearly expressed, for example, in socialism. I spent many years as a socialist, and believing that there was this primal state of humanity living in brotherhood, then alienation caused by serfdom, the feudal system, the rise of capitalism, the industrial state, and so imperialism, following a Marxist analysis. And then the state where, the condition where that is overthrown and one returns to a more primitive, non-alienated state eventually of people living in communities, sharing their goods, and the state withering away. This is the Marxist utopian model with a millenarian aspect in it, because the revolution is the millennial, the idea of the revolution ushering in a new age. I myself was much influenced by that. I was also influenced by scientific utopianism, having been educated as a scientist. And the primary scientific utopia is, of course, Sir Francis Bacon's book New Atlantis, published in 1624, in which he has this vision of an entirely new order in the world, where there's a scientific priesthood that operate in this thing called Solomon's House, which is a college that rules this island kingdom. Someone's shipwrecked on an island. They find themselves in this kind of ideal state, and it's ideal, everything's rationally ordered, and there's this scientific priesthood who run the show, live in a kind of college where they have organized research. They have gardens where they have plant breeding. They keep animals to study the animals and for vivisection experiments. They have wave machines to create tanks of water with waves in, so they can study how to make dams and harbors properly by studying artificial tides and storms on a small scale through models. They study animals and plants. They try to develop a universal language. This was satirized by Jonathan Swift in the third book of Gulliver's Travels, The Voyage to Laputa, where there's this kind of mad academy with all these people with insane projects, like making sunbeams out of cucumbers, and making things out of spiders' webs, and making incredibly strong fibers out of spiders' webs, and a man there who's trying to develop a universal language which will overcome all divisions between human beings by having universal language, a kind of sign language. He goes around with this heavy knapsack on his back, and when he wants to say anything, he fumbles around and brings out various signs which he shows to people. But he ends up with such a heavy bag of stuff he can hardly move around with it. And anyway, there's a satire of this kind of scientific utopianism written by Jonathan Swift in the first half of the 18th century. That scientific utopianism got built into the ideal of progress, of technological and scientific progress, which was going to liberate mankind from the bondage of poverty, of disease, of in slavery to the elements of nature, from fear of storm, fear of cold. In fact, it's given rise to the ideology of the modern world. Our modern world is based on a kind of scientific utopianism. The whole ideology of development. Go through the world, here are these people living fairly contentedly, as they always have done, in rainforests, but they haven't got a cash economy. So to make a cash economy, make the economy grow, to get development in place so they can buy video recorders and that kind of thing, cut down the forests, mine the ground, and have the whole, build roads, import trucks, have Coca-Cola on sale. All this kind of thing, which is now the dominant ideology of the modern world, is a transform of scientific utopianism. Then there's the liberal political utopianism that has the idea that the socialists and some of the liberals have the idea that you bring about this utopia not just through science and technology, but through economic and political reform. So there are more just institutions, more truly democratic ways. It's through social change as well as scientific and technological that this utopia will arise. I believed all this for a long time, and I think most of us do, because it's so deeply ingrained in our culture. Then there's another transform of this, the New Age movement, that there'll be a kind of new utopia brought about through discovery of ancient religious traditions, through finding out about what Oriental religions have done, through holistic approaches, harmonious ways of doing things, that a new age will dawn on Earth when everything will once again be in harmony. This is another kind of utopianism which I've been strongly influenced by. And I think Ralph's right in saying that my own book, The Rebirth of Nature, is an example of a utopian book. The essence of the argument that in the past people treated nature as alive, the earth and the heavens. There was a harmonious relationship because a recognition of the life and sacredness of nature gave a different way of relating to it than this alienated, mechanistic way of treating nature as just a bunch of raw materials to exploit for profit. So a restoration of the sense of the life of nature could lead to a new society in which heaven and earth are mediated through human beings. Human beings would be the mediator of the marriage of heaven and earth to bring about a harmonious relationship of the whole of nature on this earth, and somehow bringing human society into a right relationship to the earth and the heavens. Well, that is indeed the vision that lies behind my book, which Ralph rightly points out. And of course, some of Terence's mixed in his thinking. Half of Terence's thinking is utopian, the other half millenarian. The utopian side is the psychedelic revival, where there's this ancient society where people had a wonderful time harmoniously living on the earth with tremendous vision of all these amazing realms somehow related to botany and their ecology. Psychedelic vision, collective orgies, dissolving ego boundaries. Then it all went wrong. The deserts dried, the earth dried up, the fungi retreated, the psychedelic visions became less and less frequent, became substituted by what was originally the medium for storing the mushroom, namely a honey solution fermented, turned into alcohol, and one then plumbed the bottom, the depths represented by modern society, to be restored, the original paradise to be restored by the mass cultivation of mushrooms, the smoking of DMT, and other psychedelic revival processes. Thus would dawn the psychedelic utopia. Well, and Ralph, of course, has another version of this, the mathematical utopia, where the great regulative, eternal, if not eternal, at least objective mathematical structures, the mathematical landscape, the underlying principles which unify the earth and the heavens, the fundamental principles reflected in all nature, heavenly and terrestrial, become visible, not just to a few high priests of mathematics, but visible to potentially anybody through the medium of computer modeling. And thus there's a kind of democratization of gnosis, that direct knowledge of fundamentals, which mathematics has had as its guiding light through the centuries and the millennia. And that this Gnostic seeing behind the scenes into the roots of the way things are becomes commonly available, no longer just through psychedelic visions, but through computer models which can be shared and entered into by many people. This is what we talked about how long ago? It seems like weeks ago. It was actually about 36 hours ago, wasn't it? When we were talking about computers and the psychedelics, yesterday morning, 24 hours ago. And I think that what happened yesterday afternoon in our rather unsatisfactory discussion was that Terence, by the rules of that discussion, was denied his usual millenarian way out, and was asked to consider what would happen if the millennium were postponed, if it didn't all happen in 2012. And this forced us out of the field of millenarianism into the field of utopianism. Utopianism is to do not millenarianism, especially since millenarians usually have the end conveniently close, not too close, but close enough so that it could be in our lifetimes, not too close that it'll happen tomorrow or next year. 2012 is a perfect date from that point of view. 20 years away, it'll see us out for quite a while. It's not too close. So here's this perfect date And it really means that one doesn't have to think too much about what happens between then, now and then, because part of the millenarian scenario, as in the book of the Apocalypse, as in the book of Daniel, which in this Jewish apocalyptic literature, of which the Christian apocalypse is a derivative, this is really a Jewish tradition. It's also present in Islam to some extent. The end of history involves appalling plagues. It involves appalling diseases that sweep the earth, great earthquakes, eruptions, the seas turning to blood, a whole series of disasters, ecological, social catastrophes, including plagues and diseases. And of course, it's only too easy to see all these things coming to bear on our society, an inevitable collapse and catastrophe. And this is always the precondition for the millennium. There has to be this sense of not just things, utopianism may have touched bottom now, but millenarianism involves things getting even worse. Until the only way out is this total miraculous transformation, the coming of the Messiah, the descent of angelic powers, or in Terence's version, well, he has many versions, many ways of imagining this end of history. All of them resemble in some way a kind of collective DMT trip. And this, or if you like, a near-death or a birth experience where one passes through an appalling time of disturbance, and then there's an emergence into some totally new realm of being. So the apocalyptic tradition doesn't try to stop things getting worse necessarily. It regards it as inevitable, as part of a process being worked out. And I think that this is the conflict we all find ourselves in. Certainly we got becalmed yesterday afternoon in this area between apocalypse and millenarianism and utopianism. The utopian vision nowadays is not very strong. There are not many utopians around. The old utopianisms, the socialist one, there's hardly anyone who's into that anymore. The scientific and technological utopia, who believes the world will be saved by more science and technology, just run by technocrats? The idea, the kind of United Nations social, the world government type of utopias, of which there have been many proposed this century, embodied in the United Nations or the European Common Market, represents a kind of federalist ideal which still has some vigor and is still important. And I mean, I'm not knocking these, I think they're very important. But I don't meet many people who are wildly enthusiastic about the United Nations or even the European Common Market as the sole solution to all our ills. I mean, they have a role to play. So that isn't exactly something that commands incredible widespread popular enthusiasm. So these utopian visions that have guided so much of humanistic and socialistic thinking in the present century, secular humanism and socialism, have put their trust in this kind of rational reform, education, science and technology, world government, rational discussion. The Rio Summit was an attempt to bring that model of world agreement to bear on the ecological crisis. And according to the old-style utopian international federalist dreams, everyone would have agreed this is the best thing to do, gone back, and all the countries have hammered out a compromise, put it in place, and humanity, guided by science, would have rationally dealt with the environmental problem. As we know, that's not what happened. So utopianism is still there, it's still important, it's still strong, and an element of my thinking is utopian, an element of Ralph's thinking is utopian, an element of Terence's thinking is utopian, and probably an element of all our thinking is utopian. But what became clear yesterday afternoon is that utopianism is not enough. We're in the field of millenarianism, whether we like it or not. We're approaching the millennium now. All these apocalyptic type disasters are in place, the AIDS plague, the toxic waste, the changing climate. And these kinds of scenarios, signs of the end, are upon us, overpopulation. And this puts us very much in the field of this millenarian process. And that is, of course, part of the Christian view of history, which has become now spread throughout the whole world. Although many people are no longer Christian, this has created a kind of morphic field, a model of history which has come to imbue our whole society. And of course Terence is one of its leading exponents. What I'd like to do now is ask Terence how he sees these two strands in his own thinking. On the one hand, the archaic revival, you see, is psychedelic utopianism. On the other hand, the time wave, the end in 2012, and a great deal of his thinking is millenarian. And since he represents both so eloquently, I'd like to know how you see them connecting or linking together.
Yes, well, you're quite right about analyzing both strains of thought in my thinking. Utopianism is, as you rightly say, somewhat in discredit. On the other hand, if you restrict yourself to the realm of the rational, then you only have two choices: utopia or more history. And more history is beginning to look less and less likely. 100 years ago, that would have been, well, no, probably these two things have been balanced in people's minds for a long time. At the beginning of Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus says, "History is the nightmare from which I am trying to awaken." And I really feel that. I can't imagine 1,000 more years of human history, more wars, more discoveries, more topless photos of Fergie, more and more and more, endless to no meaning. On the other hand, utopia, which the efforts to build it have become more and more fierce, and the efforts more and more horrifying. I mean, we've had in this century 2 serious efforts to build utopia. Let's make it 3. The American, the Nazi, and the Soviet attempts to build utopias. All ended very, very badly, I think. The National Socialist utopia ended in the Second World War and in an utter discrediting of fantasy fascism. And the Soviet Union, we know that story. Our own story is in the act of unraveling at the moment, I think. And so where does that leave us then? It leaves us facing this most unlikely of all scenarios, which is the millenarian. And it's irrational. The other is rational, out of human plans, dreams, and institutions, some more humane order might be fashioned. That's the hope of utopianism. And the conflict in my thinking is, I believe in the millennium, but I think it's politically a disempowering idea. I see all these Christian fundamentalists running around. They also believe in the millennium, and they are the major anti-progressive force in most advanced societies. So how should we react to this dilemma? Well, in order to understand it, I think it's worth looking slightly afield for a moment. What we're really talking about here are origins and endpoints. And we've really been talking this morning about endpoints. But what about origins? The dominant and virtually unchallenged myth of our origin is either that God created us in 7 days along with all the rest of creation, or that the universe was born out of nothingness in a single moment for no reason. These are the 2 choices on the menu. Neither terribly compelling to rationalists, I dare say. Interesting to note that this scientific explanation, the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant, however we may think of it in terms of its veracity, notice that it's the limit case for credulity. You understand what I mean? I mean that if you can believe that, hell, you can believe anything. Sit down and try and think of something more improbable than that contention. So it's like they open up with the 1-2 punch and say, put that in front of them. If they can swallow that, then, the hydrogen bond, gene segregation, and whatever will follow hard apace, because the hard swallow comes first. Well, now I maintain that it's a very odd place to look for. What that's called is a singularity, and many theories require a singularity. It means in order to kickstart the intellectual engine, you have to go outside the system and you get one free hypothesis. And then once you've used that up, your system has to run very, very smoothly, clear down to the end. So science uses up its one free hypothesis with the Big Bang, and it says, give me the first 10 to the minus high 12 nanoseconds, and if I can do smoke and mirrors in that, then the rest will proceed quite in an orderly fashion. Now that's orthodoxy, you got to understand. That's what the straight people believe. So I think that if you get one free singularity in your model building, a more likely place to put it would be not in a featureless, dimensionless, processless vacuum, super vacuum, it isn't even a vacuum, at the beginning, but why not look toward a domain of many temperature regimes, many forms of energy, many languages, many chemical systems, many different levels of energy exchange. In other words, why not look for the singularity late in the life of the universe instead of in the immediate moments of its birth? Then what you have is a picture not of a process being pushed by causality toward some heat death billions of years in the future, but what you get is a picture of a universe that is flowing naturally toward a dwell point or a low point in the energy landscape that's at the end. That organization transcends itself, produces more complex organization, which transcends itself, which produces more complex organization, and conceivably, out of a process of avalanching complexity like that, you might actually get a singularity of some sort. And this singularity would have the character of an attractor. Now, I grant you that it's irrational, but our little discussion of the birth of the universe should convince you that it's all irrational. That doesn't get you tossed out of the game. That's the name of the game. So, being hopefully a sane person, my own inner dialogue goes back and forth between the desire to preserve rationality and hence channel energy toward utopian hope, which is reasonable. After all, we have the money, the scientific knowledge, the communication systems and so forth to solve any of our problems. Feeding the hungry, curing disease, halting the destruction of the environment. The problem is our minds, that we cannot change our minds as quickly as we can redesign harbors, flatten mountains, cut rainforests, dam rivers. These things pose no problem. changing our minds is very difficult. And because I see that, and because I see it from a psychedelic point of view, and because I don't want to abandon myself to despair, instead I see then this transcendental object at the end of time. This is not part of the utopian schema. This is part of the millenarian revelation. But it's a very persistent idea in all times and all places. This highly unlikely concept has been kept alive. And I think that we are blinding ourselves to the intentionality present in our world. I think you have to be carrying a lot of unusual intellectual baggage to not see the last 1,000 years as a moving toward a maximizing of some kind of set of goals. I mean, it's not, the triumphal march into God's kingdom envisioned by Christianity, but neither is it the trendless fluctuation that is taught in the academies. I mean, if you go to a university and ask them what is history, they will tell you it is a trendlessly fluctuating process. What they mean is it isn't going anywhere. Well, now that's interesting. If it is a trendlessly fluctuating process, then it is the only such process ever observed anywhere. Processes are not trendless. They always are under the aegis of some set of parameters which are being maximized. If a desert is drying out, then water vapor levels are dropping. That's what's being maximized, is dryness. To think of history, the very process in which mind is embedded and through which it expresses itself as trendless, it's an existential hallucination.
Sorry to interrupt. It's Lorenzo here, just to let you know that I guess I didn't do too good of a job in digitizing this tape. Apparently it came to an end and cut off, but after I turned the tape over and resumed the process, I guess I screwed up somehow. The somehow, of course, being the fact that we'd been up for several days and nights doing all of this digitizing, and my brain must have become a little digitized in the process. Anyway, I apologize for cutting Terence off in mid-sentence just now, and I apologize in advance for it just now more or less jumping into the middle of a thought and at a different recording level at that. I know there really isn't any good reason for this, but had you been there, I'm sure you would understand completely. And now back to Terence.
Going back to Plato to say that if God did not exist, human beings would create God. We are creating God. Our cultural machinery, our dreams of integration, balance, care for each other, care for the world, these are godlike aspirations. I mean, we really aspire to be God. We talk about becoming the caretakers of the world. We don't want to be Adam and Eve chewing on the fruit in the garden. We want to be the gardener, as in the original scenario. I think that the power that we have in our possession means we will realize these dreams. If not a real millennium, if not a real eschaton, then a virtual eschaton, created with such care and finesse and attention to detail that it becomes an alternative reality of some sort. So I think, people who say you set the scale too tight, if you were saying this would happen in 1,000 years or 500 years, it would just be interesting table talk. But by saying it's going to happen in 20 years, you present us with an impossible choice. But the rates of closure, the speed of acceleration toward the omega point is exponentially accelerating. We cannot imagine 2012 by looking backward 20 years and then saying we have that much more time to go through before we reach this moment. We have much more time because time is moving faster. We are compressing more events into it. And I think that, this guy, Jeremy Rifkin, wrote a book, and he's what I would consider a secular humanist or rationalist of some sort. And yet the theme of the book is that time is speeding up. And we all say this every time Russia shudders and a few more provinces are spun off into independence. Then cocktail party habitués bore each other for weeks by telling each other, have you noticed the time is speeding up? Well, I would like to take that seriously and say it is speeding up. Not human time, but the time of physics is accelerating. We can imagine ourselves colliding with an asteroid or being battered by earthquakes or something like that. But what we can't conceive of is that we are on a collision course with a kind of hyperdimensional object of some sort. What people always object to the millenarian intuition with is they say, well, you say a transcendental object is coming parallel or orthogonal to history. Don't you find it a little odd that it's going to occur in your lifetime? How convenient. Out of billions of years, it's going to occur in your lifetime. Out of billions of years, this event is going to precisely come tangential to 20th century history. That objection is not an objection at all. It's an argument in favor of my position, because you see, history is the trumpet of judgment. A million years ago, there were only animals and plants and rivers and glaciers on this planet. Human history announces the coming of the eschaton. Human history, when you open a door, first there's a crack of light that streams into the darkness. That's human history. We have cracked the door. It only lasts about 25,000 years. It creates an order in nature never before seen. The order in nature represented by a technology-using, language-using, loving, dreaming species. And then you push the door open and you see that, history was the shock wave that preceded the eschaton. This is pretty straight Christian dogma. This is what all these people have been saying, is that there is a covenant between human beings and God Almighty, and that the contract will be kept. The promise will be kept. I think it will be kept. And I think the challenge of science is to overcome the struggle with religion that characterized science's emergence, and that now science must guide us into the presence of the eschaton using the tools and the descriptive approaches that science has perfected. In other words, the proper attitude toward the eschaton is not prayer and sacrifice alone. The proper attitude is inquisitive understanding, curiosity, and delighted anticipation. It is an object in nature, like the electron, the spiral galaxy, and the human body. The end of history is a complex, a nexus, to use Whitehead's word, of temporal complexity that accounts for our existence. Without the eschaton, there would have been no human beings, no you, no me, no pyramids, no Stonehenge, no Catholic Church, no Hasidism. None of these things would exist. They are the precursive anticipations of the perfection that lies at the end of the morphogenetic process of self-expression that history is, and that we are a part of, in the sense that we represent the individual atoms that are flowing together to make the transcendental object at the end of time. I will put myself out of business long before 2012 if other people don't start seeing things my way, because part of the prophecy, if you will, is that awareness that this is happening will spread, not simply through those who take their inspiration from Gideon, but among those who study particle physics, temporal matrices, and general modeling of nature. Nature cannot be made sense of without this kind of a singularity. Science recognized that. They just put the singularity out of reach and safely in the past. But they can't explain organism, intelligence, or history. To do that, you have to take this mysterious moment of concrescent involutional totality and put it in the end state. It's a matter of simple logical necessity. The fact that it was achieved by psychedelically driven visionary shamanizing only shows how similar these two methods are in their conclusion. That's all.
Well, I'm really a little disappointed, Terence.
Oh my God, I can't take any more disappointment.
I fully expect to be meeting for another Trialogue in 2012. I think it'll be quite an important one. I'll be 76. I think that's not too old to get it on.
Get what on?
Get this on.
I never wanted to live 85 anyway.
I think that I try to challenge you both to leap to another level of discussion in the hermeneutical circle by considering ourselves in these traditions. Rupert responded by doing that, and I think maybe when he at the end challenged you with a question, perhaps you felt defensive, but I feel that rather than rewarding us with a consideration of yourself in the tradition, you instead just played another millenarian tape. Agreed, an excellent one, and it is an interesting idea, but it is not a consideration of this millennial obsession of yours in the context of a deep habit, a runnel in the morphic field of our civilization. If one did, then I think it looks more like this. We have habits. We have habits of thinking about time. We have philosophy of time, consideration of time according to certain models. The idea of time having a singularity at the beginning and singularity at the end is one model of time. And as Rupert has observed in the past, when you believe in the Big Bang, which you correctly pointed out is extremely improbable. If you can believe this, you can believe anything. You then contradict yourself by suggesting that if you can believe that, well, you gullible ones, believe this, that there's a singularity at the end.
There's more evidence.
It seems
singularity
to me that the situation is quite symmetrical, and either the singularity at the end, the eschaton pose that explains the origin of life, for example, such miracles that science confounds science, or the singularity at the beginning creates them. What's the difference? Then there's another model of time, the cyclical one, where we have the cycle of the 4 ages, which is repeated indefinitely, and not only the golden ages in the past, but the golden ages in the future too. And the Utopian Trinitarian model is a version of that laid down by Joachim when he changed the classical 4-epoch model into a 3-epoch model to agree with the Christian Trinity. Now, these two habits, which account for basically for the utopian and the millennial obsessions of the human species over this historical period of 6,000 years, these were enabled by certain mathematical models of time coming into existence, into consciousness. Like we have a line, we understand a line, then we think of a linear model of time, and a circle. Now we know circles, so our mathematical consciousness is growing. Well, recently we have new models for time. Even the greatest exponent of the fractal model of time, yourself, has, I think, contributed enormously to the history of the philosophy of time by giving a new model. And chaos theory, likewise, has given many new models for transformation which transcend the singularity concept. There are transformations that we observe in nature, that now that our mental apparatus, our mathematical cognitive capabilities has evolved to a certain point where we can recognize many other forms of transformation as being canonical things that nature does. Riane Eisler has very cleverly, I think, adapted this new development in mathematical consciousness in her own utopian vision by proposing that social transformations such as the Renaissance, which is the ultimate New Age dream, the Aquarian Age, that when the pole star moves into a new constellation, that will be enough because of the power of the heavenly realms to awaken a new level of consciousness in us. There would be, in other words, the New Age expectation is for a social transformation, a future history which is not boring. You said you're bored with life, the repetition, just another photograph of Fergie Tits. I think actually the dream of a social transformation has historical support. You said what? History is the trumpet of the human experience. We have to compare our fantasy of what is going on with the historical record. The historical record does not support the eschaton. It just doesn't. That is a particular interpretation based on a very archaic, a very old, the oldest model of time in the history of consciousness is one that you've implied to justify your millennial obsession.
Explain why it doesn't support the eschaton? I don't understand.
It doesn't support the eschaton in distinction to the other models. History is actually written according to a conceptual model.
At the beginning of what you were saying, you said that the two possibilities, the singularity at the beginning and at the end of the process of universal becoming, seemed co-equal. But to me,
equally improbable,
equally improbable.
Pointed out.
No, I didn't say that. I said I think it's much more probable to find it at the end of a process when you have great complexity than to believe it would spring from a state of utter nothingness.
Why isn't the historical record compatible with the idea of in our immediate future is an upcoming, amazing, difficult, and creative social transformation, such as the Renaissance? That means we have a future which is not boring. It may be boring until we get in the vicinity of a transformation. The transformation will be a chaotic transient from one attractor to another, a period of destabilization when all constraint of history is lifted. Novelty is empowered to actually do something instead of being constantly frustrated. And then we wake up one morning and read in the paper that the sun is rising in a different way. This has happened in the past. It's in the historical record of the people who wrote the history by whatever their model, whether it's the cyclic model for history or the linear and progressive model for history or whatever. Here's a new model. It goes along boringly the same for a while. Eventually there's a destabilization. You have a rapid change to a new equilibrium. And among these different equilibria, there is perhaps a kind of progression in the long run. In that model, these catastrophic transformations are announced by plagues, by the crash of Russia, the dissolution of the established structures, out of which phoenix from the ashes comes a new organization which might be glorious. Now, in this transformational model of history, we have the longest view written in a book, is Jim Lovelock's History of the Earth, called The Ages of Gaia. And in The Ages of Gaia, he describes the whole history of life on the planet as a series of equilibria punctuated by these catastrophic transformations. And he says in the history of the planet there are 8 of them, the really major transformations. The last one is 65 million BP
which shows
boundary.
the kind of attention
this
he gives
is
to
another
human
one on the left.
history.
So in that view, even the human species could disappear, and life may be boring for microbes, but they must go on. The biosphere is not over. Life is over. Maybe the eschaton is there for the human species.
Well, I don't know. I'm feeling like slightly mauled in all this because, as you know, I'm the purveyor of a mathematically precise theory, which, as you know, cannot be laid out in the time remaining before this group. So I'm being thrashed because it's known that I will not bring up the big guns. And so I have to sit and listen to this. The reason I don't buy the idea that this is simply one more Renaissance or one more Gothic revival is because these processes have occurred faster and faster, these breakthroughs to novelty. So it's just not that they happen, it's that they happen faster and faster, and whatever James Lovelock's affinity for something happening 65 million years ago, a few things of high interest have happened since, like everything having to do with the human world. And when you look at human history and technology and the spread of peoples and genes and so forth and so on, it's clear that we have reached some kind of limit. Maybe you get one more Renaissance before you slam into the wall, but not a dozen, not 100. This is not the Renaissance. This is not the rise of Rome. This is the final global crisis.
Yes,
and the objective data supports that.
I know, but it's so provincial, Terence. I mean, there's a sense in which this millenarian vision is a product of a historical model that grew up within one branch of human consciousness, the Judeo-Christian Islamic branch. There's a sense in which you could argue that all this is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Having unleashed these millenarian visions, our history is being driven by millenarian visions which have actually empowered and directed the discovery of America, the opening up of the New World, the development of the atom bomb, the rise of science and technology. Most of the things that are actually creating the crisis are man-made. And therefore there's a sense in which this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And even if we collide into this wall of history here on Earth, I find it quite incredible that the rest of the solar system is just going to shut up shop and go out of business, let alone the galaxy, let alone the clusters of galaxies.
Who thinks the sun is alive.
Oh, all right. The sun could undergo a tremendous transformation. I'll concede the entire solar system to you. But that leaves an awful lot else. The rest of the galaxy.
Take it. I'll settle for the solar system. The galaxy can take care of itself.
Well, no, it can't, you see, because we now move. This is what I mean about provincial thinking. First of all, it's limited to a tiny fraction of the cosmos. And I see the same problem with Teilhard de Chardin. Is the omega point just about human destiny on Earth, or just the destiny of the Earth, or even the solar system? Or is it about the entire cosmos, countless trillions of galaxies, stars everywhere, incredible? I can't believe that the extinction of human life on Earth, the kind of transformation you're talking about, even the implosion of the entire solar system is going to set up more than the most minute ripples throughout even our galaxy.
Well, but implicit in that objection is that you really think those galaxies are there. You really believe that there are millions of light years of space and time filled with spiral galaxies. That could all be scream. The true size of the cosmic stage is a hotly debated subject even among the experts.
All right, but
and when you say it's too local, then you attack it if one takes the other position and say, but then how can you possibly believe that it's universal? Well, you only have two choices, either what you disdainfully call provincialism or what you disdainfully call universalism. It's got to be one or the other. I am uncomfortable with the universal thing myself. However, I also am uncomfortable with the idea that the universe, as described by Newtonian astronomers, should just be absolutely unchallenged. This anthropocentric principle that they've begun to allow into their deliberations suggests that, maybe the stars aren't as fixed in their courses as we imagine, and that somehow events on the Earth could have a kind of cosmic significance. I mean, I'm just speculating. I'm not wedded to this.
well, let me first I'll do my other objection to millenarianism as proposed by you.
We have 10 minutes remaining.
Okay, very quickly. The true millenarian vision and the apocalyptic tradition is more like what Ralph says. It's a period. It's not a total. Everything suddenly disappears in a blinding light. It's a period of transformation followed by a millennium, a period of the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Right.
Now that, I think, is something that's lacking from your vision. At least you don't think beyond this 2012.
No, I would
I'm interested not in
the term eschatonic or something like that.
Yours is much more absolute.
Yes, right.
Now, I'm more inclined to traditional millenarianism, like Ralph is, a transitional period followed by some kind of kingdom of heaven on earth. And what I think the kingdom of heaven on earth could involve is, first of all, psychedelics, secondly, the revival of animism, thirdly, mathematical objects visible to all through computers, and fourthly, communication with the stars, so that through conscious communication, a network of consciousness begins to link up far beyond the Earth to other stars, other galaxies, along the lines we were discussing last night. 1,000 years to effect this linking up of consciousness throughout the entire cosmos, at the end of which the true and absolute eschaton might be possible. Right now, it would be confined to Earth, or at least the solar system.
Well, the only difference you and I have on this is I think that this 1,000 years should be scaled back by 2 orders of magnitude. It's 10 years. It's from 2002 to 2012, and you will have your psychedelic legality, your cured AIDS, your orgies, your food for everyone. The millennium will dawn, I think, sometime around 2002 or 3 or something like that. But it doesn't last 1,000 years. That was a naivete by virtue of the prophecy being made in a different era of the compression of time. It will then build quite naturally toward the revelation of the eschaton sometime around 2012. What do you think about that or anything else? I mean, this is
Well, we have had planned aborted plan included a space for a response to the weekend from everyone. And now we need a new plan, so let's consider this together. We can quit now making extra space for final hugs, which I think are very appropriate in case Terence is right.